Welcome everyone. My name is Liz Cohen Nyode, and while the Hoboken Public Library is closed temporarily and you are at home, I am fortunate to be able to teach you via the Hoboken Public Library YouTube channel. I will be filming lessons similar to what we would be doing every Wednesday at the Hoboken Public Library, and they will be available for you to view and participate in via the YouTube channel. So for every lesson that I will be teaching, I'm going to start with a specific artist and talk about the artist, a little bit about their bio, about the type of work they do, their techniques, their procedures, their aesthetics, and their philosophy of art. I will show you, whenever possible, images of their work in the hopes that these images will inspire you to do your own kind of work. And when appropriate, I will be doing a demonstration of the kinds of work that I think you can do after looking at this particular artist. Today, the artist of focus will be an artist that I think many of you are familiar with. Her name is Georgia O'Keeffe. I've chosen Ms. O'Keeffe because we are now in March, and March is the month that we call Women's History Month. It is the time in the United States when we celebrate the major contributions of women to the culture and society of the United States. O'Keeffe is probably one of the most famous American artists that we know of. She was born in 1886 and died in 1986 at the age of 98. In her early years, she was influenced by an art teacher named Arthur Dow. Arthur Dow believed in art as a form of expression, and he was one of the first artists who was moving away from the need to recreate realistic images. Dow was a major influence on O'Keeffe, and he enabled her to do much more expressive and less realistic imagery. O'Keeffe is probably most famous for her images of close-ups of flowers, buildings, and bones and skulls that she collected in her years living in New Mexico. Early on, she moved to New York City, where she fell under the influence of Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz was a photographer and gallery owner who was a major mover in bringing modern art to the United States. And he invited many of the European modern and avant-garde artists to show in New York. So while while O'Keeffe was working with Stieglitz, she was influenced by these artists as well, and of course by Stieglitz himself. He exhibited her work in his gallery, and that's when her fame began. She and Stieglitz married, had a long and loving relationship, but at a certain point in her life, Georgia realized that New York was no longer an inspiration for her. And in her travels, she had been to New Mexico and fallen in love with the landscape. She built a home, and half the year she would spend in New Mexico, and the other half of the year she would spend in New York with Stieglitz. But her most prolific work times and work years were spent during her times in New Mexico, and that is the work that she is most famous for. If you're interested in more details about Ms. O'Keeffe's life, I invite you to Google her name and find out more about her. You can also, if you're lucky enough to be able to afford to travel to New Mexico, visit her fantastic museum, the George O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The Museum of Modern Art also owns some of her work that you can view right here in New York City when the museums reopen. And also the Art Institute of Chicago owns quite a large collection of her work. So I would like to recommend this particular book called George O'Keeffe. It is a seminal book about her work. It does have a little bit of biographical information, but it is quite wonderful for the photographs and prints of her actual work. I'm going to share some of those pictures with you, and then I will discuss a little bit about O'Keeffe's personal philosophy of art, the aesthetics that she used, and finally I'm going to do a demonstration of the kind of project that I think you could do at home quite comfortably and quite easily, and I offer it to you for your personal enjoyment. So let's begin by looking at some pictures of her work. Most of the pictures in this book come from the work that she did in New Mexico, and I'm going to show you an image of her flowers because, as I mentioned earlier, I believe her work with flowers is probably her most famous imagery. What O'Keeffe liked to do was to move away from things as objects and think about them as a series of shapes, lines, colors, and textures. As you can see from this is a painting, and as you can see from the image, the object, the flowers, is starting to dissolve, and what you can see is more of an abstract idea of what flowers are. Notice the colors that she uses. She used quite saturated colors in most of her work. She liked intense, vibrant color. Let's look for another image that I think you'll like. So this is a painting of a Jensenweed flower. Jensenweed, I believe, are quite common in New Mexico, and Ms. O'Keeffe loved this flower. She loved the shape, she loved how she could play around with depth of field and actually go into the internal parts of the flower. And this is what she did a lot. She would focus on a small detail in the flower or whatever object she was painting, and she would look at those very small details and enlarge them until they filled the whole page. And that's why quite often her flowers look not like flowers at all, but just colors, lines, shapes, and textures. Okay, one more painting to look at. This time, let's move away from flowers and look at another image Ms. O'Keeffe is famous for. So this is the final one that we're going to look at today. This is actually a picture of a rock that Georgia found. She frequently walked around her property in New Mexico. All right. So, as I've been talking about while showing you pictures, you can see that Georgia really loved nature, really wanted to explore things that were available to her on a daily basis and use them as inspirations for her own work. And I thought, since most of us are stuck at home at this point in time, it would be really relaxing and calming and enjoyable to work in Ms. O'Keeffe's style, to free up your mind from the stresses and worries that may be present in your life at this time, and to really focus on something small and intimate and create an image of that object. So what I did first today was walk around my house and look for objects that I find beautiful and pleasing. I looked for objects that had interesting textures, colors, lines, and shapes, just as Ms. O'Keeffe would have done at her ranch in New Mexico. I do have some flowers, as you can see. I'm a major lover of shells, so I collect many shells. I particularly love the conch shell, and I have placed the shells and the flowers on the table in order that I can draw and paint them. So now I'm going to demonstrate the type of thing that you can do in your own home for your art project for this week. I have also watercolor paper. I like using watercolor paper because it has what artists called a tooth. A tooth simply means that the paper is very textured and rough, and that enables the paper to absorb quite a bit of liquid. And we will also be using watercolor paints today. So even if you don't have watercolor paper, try and find a heavyweight paper that you may have in your house. It might even be wrapping paper, anything that has a bit of heft to it. I wouldn't recommend using photocopy paper. It's too thin and smooth. So look for a kind of drawing paper or other watercolor paper or other heavier weight paper to use. We will be using watercolor, as I mentioned, but I like to start every painting that I do with a very light sketch in pencil. I've selected large size paper, I hope you can see, because as I've been saying, Ms. O'Keeffe liked to take small objects, look at the tiny details in them, and then enlarge them to fill the whole canvas or the whole large paper. Some of her paintings are huge. In fact, she had one of her most famous paintings is called Sky. She did a painting based on an image she remembered from looking out the window of an airplane. And the painting is mural size. It covers the entire wall in a room at the Art Institute of Chicago. So think big. Look at tiny objects, but think big in the execution of this project. All right, here we go. Have my sharpened pencil. The first thing I like to do is create a frame. Artists often like to make a picture frame because it enables us to determine where we're going to place the image, and it helps us to control the amount of space that we can use. These things are good to plan ahead for in order to make a beautiful painting. All right, I think because O'Keeffe was so very fond of flowers, I'm going to focus on the flower today. If we have time, I might make a shell painting for you as well. So I love these flowers because they have a great deal of detail, And I'm going to focus just on the central portion of the flowers when I do my sketch. Again, remember, I'm thinking large, even though I'm looking at tiny objects. And it's as if you had a camera and you were able to expand the lens in order to blow it up or make it bigger. You're going to take the tiny forms and textures and enlarge them on the paper. All right, here we go. I sketch lightly. It's a good idea to keep your eyes more on the object that you're drawing and less on your paper. If you notice, I'm focusing mainly on the flower itself and less on my painting. I glance back and forth between the object and the paper. Notice how I'm filling up as much of the space in the central part of the picture frame I created in the beginning. Try and keep your lines loose and free. Remember, Ms. O'Keeffe's work was very abstract. You do not have to strive for realism. This is not doing an exact replica of what you're looking at. You are, again, looking at tiny forms and textures and enlarging them to fill up the entire space. In fact, a good tip is to have the object or objects touch the edges of the frame that you created initially. All right, I feel as if I've done enough sketching, and now I'm going to begin painting. Some tips about painting and watercolor paints in particular. First of all, brushes. If you are lucky enough to have many brushes at your house, or if you're able to go out during this time and purchase brushes, or if you want to purchase online, it's important to know that brushes come in a variety of shapes and sizes. I mean, this is basic and fundamental, but it's something that will help you in the process of creating. Larger, soft brushes are excellent for doing what we call a wash. A wash is the way watercolor artists lay down their paint in the first stages of their painting. And this is a terrific kind of brush to use for that. So again, soft, large brushes for the first steps of your watercolor painting. Then obviously brushes are going to get smaller. They also vary in shape. Some are rounded, some are pointed. Smaller pointed brushes are much better for doing the final touches in your painting, outlining and detail work. They're also excellent, depending on their shape, they're excellent for different textural techniques. This brush is stiff and square on the ends, and it is good for a kind of feathered texture. This brush is rounded, and again, because it's so small, it's perfect for doing tiny details. All right, watercolor paints. Watercolor paints come in a variety of ways. This is a watercolor kit. It is what we call dry watercolor paints or cake watercolor paints. You can see that it comes in many, many colors. You can purchase online watercolor kits that have every color you could ever possibly need. This particular brand of watercolor paint, I think, is the best brand of paint available to artists. It's called Winsor Newton. And I think however. So watercolor paints come dry, just like the ones that I've shown you in the box. They also come in tubes, and if you know that there are particular colors that you are going to use over and over again, you're going to want to start thinking about buying your watercolor paints in tubes. The paints that come in tubes are liquid already. They are a thick liquid, but you mix them with water to make them easier to use. All right, we're ready to start painting. One item that you will need is paper towels. So always have some paper towels or napkins handy to use. And a cup of paint. And I happen to be working on my dining room table, so I've covered the table with newspaper. Oh, and here's something else that I'd like to recommend. If you have anywhere in your apartment or home that you can carve aside as your own personal studio space, I recommend that you do this. You want to have a place in your house that can be messy, that you can be a little bit freer in, that you don't have to worry about cleaning up every single time you use it. Because not every work of art is going to be completed in one single sitting. So you want to be able to leave your work as is and then come back to it when you need to, if there are any interruptions. All right, as I mentioned before, there is a technique called creating a wash. And basically all that is to wet one of your larger brushes and apply water to the page. Particularly where you have larger shapes, the background, for example, larger forms within the internal space in the painting. You want them to be relatively wet. Remember that O'Keeffe filled in every portion of her painting with color. Even when she was working with lighter color flowers, she used light paint. All right. I'm very partial to keeping my background dark, so I'm going to use a darker color to begin. You also will need something that you can use as a palette. I'm using the lid of my paint box. You can get paper plates or an old ceramic plate to mix your colors. Something flat is all you need. Parchment paper would work. Newspaper would work for your palette. So I'm mixing different shades of blue. I don't want it to be too blue, however. So I'm going to add a tiny bit of orange. Orange and blue, when mixed together, create neutral earth tones. And I'm painting loosely and freely because when we do a wash, we want to keep it thin and transparent. We want to allow the paint to flow wherever it wants to go. And this is a quality of watercolor paint that you should recognize. It's more difficult to control than other types of paint, but that is the beauty of watercolor paint. It is part of the joy of using watercolor paint to allow it to do its own thing. With this kind of work, I invite you to let go of your desire for perfection. Art that is perfect or work that is perfect, I don't even classify as art. Those of you who are veteran students of mine, you're probably sick of hearing my favorite expression, if it's perfect, it ain't art. What makes it art is when your own personal style of working shows through in what you create. And that only comes about by letting things flow with this particular kind of project in paint. It only comes about by letting things flow and basically do their own thing. You can even do this. Some of you may shudder in horror, but one of the beauties of watercolor paint is if you use plenty of water, you can allow the paint to drip and flow wherever it wants to go. And then I'm going to show you how you can literally use that in what you create. So now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, and I'm going to work on some of the internal shapes that I want to create in the image. So the flowers that I were looking at are lavender. I will probably, and you will probably not be able to recreate the exact color, but that doesn't matter. Again, if it's exactly the same as the object that you're looking at, if it's exactly perfect, it's not allowing your own personality and style to shine through in your work. And that's my goal. I want to help you learn to use your way of looking at things, your style, to express yourself in this project. I'm mixing a color that I think is close to what I'm looking at. You're going to find color mixing a very pleasurable activity. Okay, now, because the paper is a little bit drier, even though the first colors I applied were darker in hue, they are starting to fade as the paint dries out. And so the paint that I'm adding now, the wetter paint, looks darker and more intense. And that's what's supposed to happen. That's what takes place naturally. Keep looking at the object as you go. Don't try and do it from memory. Very few artists work from memory, including those that we consider to be the great European masters like Leonardo and Michelangelo. They always had a model. They always had a real object in front of them when they were painting. They never did it from their memory. So I'm going to continue painting for a little bit longer. I am not going to complete the painting that I'm creating because I want you folks to have the opportunity to start doing your own. The final thing that I'm going to teach you before saying goodbye is how to do the finishing touches. Once you've laid down the colors of the larger shapes, you've done your wash of the background, you've filled in the medium-sized areas, and your paper is starting to be a little bit drier. You now have the opportunity to start adding details. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So details. You want to find a brush that has a very fine point. If you go to the Dick Blick website, you'll see that there are many different types of fine detail brushes. Just find one with a very sharp point on the end. This particular kind of brush is made, I believe, by Sakura. The brand name is Sakura. It is a Japanese watercolor brush, and you can make lines as thin as a pencil point with this kind of brush. It even has a hollow chamber in the handle that you can fill with water, and it will keep your paints moist as you use them. All right. So the details in this chrysanthemum that I am looking at are quite dark. If you look into the internal part of the flower, on the inside of the petals, there's no light, and so the details will appear very dark. I also in my work like to outline my objects because it really makes the object pop and come alive. Here's some advice about doing your detail work. There are several parts to the brush. There's the hair part, obviously. There's the silver portion of the brush, or the portion of the brush that is closest to the hairs on the brush, and then there's the handle. When you're doing the washes, you should hold the brush at the end of the handle and let things, as I said before, be loose and free. When you're doing detail work, you want to grip the brush closer to the hair. And this is wonderful because it enables you to really have a firm grip, and it enables you to get closer to what you're doing and be in greater control. At this point too, you want to use less water and load your brush up with more paint. Notice the way I'm resting my pinky, and I'm right-handed, so the pinky of my right hand on the paper. Again, keep looking at your object. Don't try and do it from memory. Even I tend to cheat. I prefer looking at my painting as opposed to looking at the object. You really have more success in your work if you continue glancing back at what you're trying to paint. Do remember too that when you finish this painting, it's going to be abstract and not realistic. You're trying to capture the essence of the object that you're looking at, not the real thing. Focus on those tiny details and remember that you're trying to enlarge them. Right now, I'm working on each individual petal, outlining, making darker in the center to indicate where the petals are darkest, where they curve inwards. Ultimately, I'm going to go very dark because on the inside of the petals, there's no light. You can also work on watercolor paintings in stages. You can put down one layer of paint, go away to do something else, and come back to work on it when it's drier. That's a perfect thing to do when you're trying to recreate the details. All right. So as you can see at this point, it's completely abstract. It looks nothing like the flower itself, and that's okay, because we're just beginning. One final word of instruction from me: when the painting is complete, when you've done the objects that you're focusing on, now is the time to start adding more to the background area, particularly around the edges of the flower or whatever object you're looking at. This will emphasize the flower itself or the object and make it more exciting for the viewer to look at. So I like to work on creating shadow, first of all, where I see it in the real object, but also in the background to make the object itself pop out. Pop is an art expression, to make it pop and come alive. Again, keep revisiting your palette to mix colors. With this kind of work too, you can use a little bit of your imagination, particularly in the background area. You can use colors that you might not actually be looking at in these big, big background shapes. Again, experiment with going dark in certain places. I think frequently we're a little bit frightened of the darker tones, but with watercolor paint, colors tend to fade, and particularly when your paper is wet, they might not show up as much. So do use darks where appropriate, particularly when you're outlining or on the internal shapes. So I'm not finished, but as you can see, the process continues with my painting. You can see that a flower image is starting to emerge, but not a realistic flower. I am, again, trying to capture the feeling or the essence of the flower, just as Miss O'Keeffe would have done in her own work. So your goal today is to create an enlarged watercolor painting of a small object that you find around your home. If you are lucky enough to have watercolor paints, I invite you to do it in watercolor. If you do not and you are able, you can order a watercolor kit. I recommend Winsor Newton paints to create this work. Another suggestion, if you have no watercolor paints available, drawing is always a great way to go. I believe it's the highest form of art there is. You can always take an object, look at it at close quarters, observe the details carefully, and do a wonderful sketch in pencil. So I hope that you have enjoyed. I hope that this will give you a period of relief and beauty while you are at home during this difficult time. I invite you to come back next week. I will be creating more videos about making art. They will be shown on the Hoboken Public Library YouTube channel. You can visit the Hoboken Library website, which is hobokenlibrary.org, and it will, I believe, direct you to the YouTube channel in which you can view. So today we studied Georgia O'Keeffe. Next month, April, we will be going back to our study. For those of you who are my veteran students, we're going to be going back to exploring drawing the human figure. Those of you who are new to drawing, don't worry about it. I'm going to be giving further instruction on how to draw the human figure, and I guarantee that you're going to love it. The artist that we will look at next week is to be determined, but I will choose someone that I think you will find engaging and interesting. So again, thank you so much for joining us here. Any comments or questions you can direct to us at www.hobokenlibrary.org. Enjoy.